when 5 ruthless bounty hunters rode into the dusty town of Silver Creek, confident they could easily claim the $50,000 on Eli Cade's head. They thought they were hunting just another desperate outlaw hiding from his past. They couldn't have been more wrong. Behind the quiet demeanor of their target lay the deadliest sharpshooter the border wars had ever seen. A legendary marksman who could judge wind speeds by watching grass bend and calculate bullet trajectories that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. What began as a simple bounty hunt exploded into a relentless game of cat and mouse that would expose a web of military corruption, ignite a 5-year vendetta, and prove that the most dangerous predator isn't the one that hunts with brute force, but the patient warrior who's learned to live without violence, until violence becomes the only path to justice. This is the story of how a disgraced war hero and an honor-bound female bounty hunter reminded a corrupt power broker and his hired killers that true strength lies not in the ability to take a life, but in knowing when to spare one. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The summer heat hung heavy in the air as dust devils danced across the main street of Silver Creek. Inside the Red Mesa Saloon, the usual afternoon chatter filled the air. The clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, and the murmur of voices discussing everything from cattle prices to the latest stagecoach robbery. The wooden ceiling fans spun lazily, doing little to dispel the thick heat that had settled over the town. Tom Wesley, the weathered barkeep who'd served drinks in Silver Creek for over 2 decades, reached beneath his counter and pulled out a fresh wanted poster. The thick parchment felt heavy in his hands as he made his way to the bulletin board near the entrance. The saloon's regular patrons barely noticed him until the sharp rap of his hammer, hitting nails, cut through the ambient noise. The poster showed a man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through whoever looked at them. Below the sketch, in bold letters read, "Wanted. Eli Cade, $50,000 reward, dead or alive." The silence that followed was deafening. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even the card players set down their hands. $50,000 was more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. "Sweet mother of mercy," whispered Jake Cooper, a local rancher. "That's more than the bank robbery gang from last spring." Before anyone could respond, the saloon's batwing doors creaked open. 5 figures stepped inside, their spurs jingling against the wooden floor. The afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the room as they made their way to a corner table, each movement deliberate and practiced. Their leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and a weathered duster, sat with his back to the wall. This was Hank Morrison, known throughout the territory for his tactical mind and quick draw. To his right sat Marcus Red Cloud, a tracker whose abilities were said to rival those of the native scouts. Next to him was Benjamin Boom Thompson, whose expertise with explosives had earned him both his nickname and a reputation for getting into and out of impossible situations. Sarah Mitchell, the only woman in the group, took her seat with quiet grace. Her calculating eyes scanned the room as she adjusted the rifle slung across her back. The last member of their group, Diego Ramirez, settled into his chair with fluid ease, his collection of throwing knives catching the light. "Well, would you look at that?" Hank drawled, nodding toward the wanted poster. "Seems we arrived just in time for the party." Tom approached their table, wiping his hands on his apron. "What can I get you folks?" "Whiskey." "Leave the bottle," Hank replied, tossing a coin onto the table. "And whatever information you have about this Eli Cade." Tom's expression darkened as he set down the glasses. "Careful what you wish for, Mr. Morrison. I recognize you and your crew. You've got quite the reputation yourselves. But Eli Cade," he shook his head slowly. "He's different." Hank let out a dismissive laugh, studying the wanted poster from across the room. "Different? Look at him. Man's got the look of someone who's spent too long hiding in the shadows. Probably some washed-up outlaw who's lost his nerve." "I wouldn't be so sure," Tom persisted, his voice dropping lower. "There's stories about him that would make your blood run cold." "Stories are just that, stories," Hank replied, pouring whiskey into the glasses. "And $50,000 is 50,000 reasons not to care about them." From the bar, a drunk prospector with a tangled gray beard swayed on his feet. "You folks don't know nothing about Eli Cade," he called out, his voice thick with liquor and emotion. I served with him in the border wars, I did. The hunters exchanged amused glances as the old man stumbled toward their table, sloshing his drink. Tell me then, old-timer, Hank said, gesturing to an empty chair. Enlighten us about this legendary man. The prospector's rheumy eyes took on a distant look. It was during the siege of Fort Mason. We were surrounded, low on ammunition. The enemy had sharpshooters in the hills, picking us off one by one. Couldn't even raise your head above the walls without getting it blown off. He took a shaky sip of his drink. Then Eli. He climbs up to the tower, takes position with his rifle. 7 hours he stayed there, not moving, barely breathing. When the sun set that day, he'd taken out every single enemy marksman. 17 shots, 17 kills. Some of them were over 800 yards away. Diego snickered. 17 perfect shots? Come on, abuelo. Not even the best shooters in the army could make those shots consistently. It's true, the old man insisted, pounding his fist on the table. I saw it with my own eyes. Man's got a gift, or a curse, depending on how you look at it. They say he can judge wind speed just by watching grass move, can account for the Earth's rotation in his shots. Hank raised an eyebrow. The Earth's rotation? Now I know you're spinning tales, old man. Next you'll tell us he can shoot around corners. The group laughed, but Sarah remained quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. 50,000 is a lot of money for one man, she said finally. Especially for someone who's supposedly just hiding from his past. Makes you wonder what he did to earn such a price on his head. Does it matter? Hank shot back. Money's money, Sarah. Start questioning the why of things, and you'll talk yourself right out of a payday. I'm just saying, Sarah began, but Hank cut her off with a sharp gesture. You're not here to think. You're here because you can shoot, and because I trust you to watch my back. That's it. The tension at the table was broken by the arrival of a young boy, no more than 12, his clothes covered in dust from the road. He whispered something in Marcus's ear, then disappeared back into the crowd. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. Got word from one of my contacts. Cade was spotted 3 days ago, near Rattlesnake Creek, buying supplies at the trading post. If we move fast, we can pick up his trail while it's still fresh. Hank drained his glass and stood. Then what are we waiting for? Pack up, we ride in 10 minutes. As the hunters gathered their gear, a figure in the shadows of the bar watched intently. Once they had left, he slipped out the back door and made his way to the telegraph office. The operator looked up as he entered, recognition flickering across his face. Send this to the usual address, the man said, sliding a piece of paper across the counter. The message was simple. 5 hunters. Heading your way. Morrison's crew. Miles away, in a small cabin nestled among the pines, Eli Cade stood motionless, his rifle trained on a distant tree. The weapon was an extension of his body, as natural as breathing. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and he adjusted his aim almost imperceptibly. The crack of the shot broke the silence, and a small branch, no thicker than a man's thumb, fell from the tree nearly 400 yards away. Eli lowered his rifle, his expression unchanged. He'd been practicing this shot for hours, preparing for what he knew was coming. The bounty hunters would be here soon, confident in their abilities, sure of their prey. They would expect to find a man in hiding, afraid and desperate. What they would find instead was something very different. Back on the trail, Marcus knelt in the dirt, studying signs that would be invisible to most men. Tracks are fresh, he said, running his fingers over a depression in the ground. He's traveling alone, moving light, heading northeast toward the mountains. The hunters mounted their horses, eager to begin the chase. None of them noticed the glint of sunlight on metal from the ridgeline above, where Eli Cade watched their every move through his scope. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. First, they needed to learn exactly who they were dealing with. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, the hunters made camp for the night. They were confident, assured of their eventual success. They had no way of knowing that every step they took brought them closer, not to their prey, but to a revelation that would shake their confidence to its core. In the gathering darkness, Eli Cade moved like a ghost through the wilderness, always watching, always one step ahead. The hunters thought they were closing in on him, but in reality, He was drawing them into his world, a world where distance and accuracy meant the difference between life and death, where patience was measured in heartbeats, and where overconfidence was often fatal. The stage was set. The hunters had made their choice. And soon, very soon, they would discover exactly why the bounty on Eli Cade's head was so high, if they lived long enough to learn from their mistake. Dawn broke over Dead Man's Canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and amber. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the faint scent of sage and desert dust. In the shadow of the towering canyon walls, 5 figures moved with practiced stealth, setting up their positions for an ambush. Hank Morrison studied the narrow passage ahead through his spyglass. "This is the only way through for 20 miles, he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "If Cade's heading to the mountains like Marcus says, he'll have to come through here. Unless he knows we're waiting," Sarah Mitchell replied, adjusting her rifle's sight. She'd chosen a position on a natural stone shelf that offered both cover and a clear view of the canyon floor. Hank shot her an irritated look. "Getting cold feet already?" "Being cautious isn't the same as being afraid," she countered. "We've all heard what happened to the Lancaster gang when they underestimated their mark." Benjamin "Boom" Thompson chuckled as he carefully placed charges at strategic points along the canyon walls. "Lancaster was an amateur. We're professionals." He patted one of his explosives with almost fatherly affection. "Besides, one wrong move from Cade, and I'll bring half this canyon down on his head." Diego Ramirez took up his position behind a boulder, his throwing knives arranged within easy reach. "Just remember, amigos, dead or alive pays the same. But dead doesn't shoot back." Marcus Red Cloud said nothing as he studied the ground, his fingers tracing faint marks in the dust. His expression was troubled, but he kept his concerns to himself. Something about the tracks didn't feel right, but he couldn't put his finger on why. The hunters settled into their positions as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Minutes stretched into hours. The desert heat built steadily, making their leather gear stick to their skin and mirages dance across their vision. "Maybe we should move up the canyon," Diego suggested after 4 hours of waiting. He could have. A distant rumble cut him off. The sound echoed through the canyon like rolling thunder, though the sky was cloudless. "Rockslide," Marcus said, rising to his feet. "About a quarter-mile east." Hank raised his hand, signaling the group to hold position. "Could be natural. Could be," Marcus agreed. "But in my experience, there's no such thing as coincidence in the desert." Another rumble followed, closer this time. Loose pebbles skittered down the canyon walls. "Benjamin, Diego, check it out," Hank ordered. "Sarah, keep your rifle on the pass. Marcus, with me. We'll circle around high, get a better view." The group split up, exactly as Eli Cade had anticipated. From his position high in the rocks, he watched them through his scope, noting how they moved, how they communicated, how they covered each other. These weren't common bounty hunters. They were professionals, and that made them dangerous. But being dangerous wasn't the same as being prepared. Benjamin and Diego approached the source of the sound cautiously, weapons ready. They found a pile of fresh rubble at the base of a cliff, dust still settling around it. "Natural, my ass," Benjamin muttered, studying the scene. These rocks were placed. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. Benjamin's gun went flying from his hand, spinning away into the rocks. Before he could react, another shot knocked Diego's primary knife from its sheath. "Take cover," Benjamin shouted, diving behind a boulder as more shots rang out. Each bullet found its mark with surgical precision, disarming rather than killing. Diego's remaining knives, Benjamin's backup pistol, all went spinning away into the dust. Up on the ridge, Hank and Marcus spun toward the sound of gunfire. "Sarah," Hank shouted into his radio. "Do you have eyes on the shooter?" "Negatives." Sarah's voice crackled back. "He's shooting from multiple positions. Has to be moving between shots, but I can't spot him." Another shot cracked out. Marcus felt the bullet pass close enough to feel its wake before his rifle was knocked from his hands. He dove for cover, drawing his pistol, only to have it shot away as well. "Hell's bells," Hank breathed, genuine fear creeping into his voice for the first time. He raised his own weapon, trying to spot their attacker, but the canyon's acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint the source of the shots. Sarah scanned the cliffs frantically through her scope. Movement caught her eye, a flash of shadow against stone. She squeezed the trigger, but her target was already gone. He's playing with us, she realized aloud. He could have killed any of us by now. A pained cry drew their attention. Jake, one of their support team members who'd been guarding their horses, stumbled into view clutching his arm. Blood seeped between his fingers where a bullet had grazed him. "Get down, you fool!" Hank shouted, but Jake was already collapsing behind a rock, his face pale with shock. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The canyon fell silent, except for the soft patter of ejected shell, casings landing somewhere in the rocks above. "Everyone still breathing?" Hank called out. A chorus of shaky affirmatives came back. They regrouped slowly, keeping low, expecting another barrage at any moment. But none came. Marcus examined the ground where their attacker had been, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. "These tracks, they lead everywhere and nowhere." He's doubled back, crossed his own trail, used the rocks to leave no prints at all in some places. "Can you follow him?" Hank demanded. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I can try, but he knows we're tracking him. These marks, they're too perfect, too obvious in some places. He's leaving them on purpose. He's toying with us," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than the others. She knelt beside Jake, examining his wound. The bullet had barely broken the skin, a warning shot, nothing more. He could have killed him, could have killed any of us. Why didn't he? "Because he's a coward," Hank spat, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. "Won't face us in a fair fight." "Or maybe," Sarah suggested, "he's not what we were told he was." They found the message an hour later, carved deep into a flat rock face near their ambush site. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." Hank ran his fingers over the letters, his jaw tight with anger. "Trying to scare us off? It's a bluff." "Is it?" Sarah challenged him. "He just took out 5 armed professionals without breaking a sweat. Didn't kill a single one of us when he could have. Does that sound like the desperate outlaw we were told about?" High above them, hidden in the shadows of a narrow crevice, Eli Cade watched the argument unfold through his scope. The woman, Sarah, was sharper than the others. She'd noticed what he wanted them to notice. The rest, they would learn or they would fail. As he observed them, memories flickered through his mind unbidden. Another canyon, another time, the border wars, 8 years ago. He'd been younger then, still believing in causes and flags and the righteousness of orders. His spotter, Tommy Chun, had been calling out wind speeds and distances as Eli provided cover fire for a retreating patrol. 1045 yards, Tommy had said. Crosswind from the west, 8 miles per hour. Temperature dropping with the sun. You'll need to adjust. Eli had made the shots, one after another. 18 men trying to flank their position. 18 clean kills. The patrol had survived, but the weight of those deaths had settled into Eli's bones. He learned then that being good at killing didn't make it right, and that following orders wasn't the same as doing what needed to be done. The memory faded as he watched the hunters below begin to gather their scattered weapons. They were shaken, but not beaten. Not yet. "We need to regroup," Hank was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Get back to town, resupply. Come at this from a different angle." "And then what?" Diego demanded, still searching the ground for his scattered knives. "He knows our plays now. Knows how we move, how we think. Then we change the game," Hank replied grimly. "Call in some favors. Get more men, more firepower. More targets, you mean?" Sarah muttered, but she began packing up her gear with the others. Eli watched them go, his finger resting lightly on his rifle's trigger guard. He could end it now, put bullets through their hearts before they knew what hit them. But that wasn't his way. Never had been. They needed to understand what they were really part of, and why the price on his head was so high. The hunters mounted their horses and began picking their way out of the canyon, jumping at every loose stone that clattered down the cliffs. They rode closer together now, their earlier confidence replaced by wary alertness. Marcus Red Cloud took up the rear, studying the back trail. He alone seemed to sense the eyes still watching them, measuring them, judging them. He alone seemed to understand that they hadn't just failed to spring their trap. They had walked right into someone else's. As the group disappeared around a bend in the canyon, Eli finally moved from his hiding spot. He knew they would be back. Men like Hank Morrison didn't give up easily, especially not with $50,000 on the line. But they would come back different, warier, more desperate, more dangerous. Good. They needed to be afraid, needed to understand that every step they took deeper into this hunt brought them closer not to their prey, but to a truth they weren't ready to face. A truth about corruption, about justice, about the price of doing what was right in a world that rewarded what was wrong. Eli packed up his rifle with practiced efficiency, each movement precise and economical. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls in deep reds and purples. Soon the desert night would come, bringing its own dangers and opportunities. He paused at the top of the ridge, looking back the way the hunters had gone. They would regroup, resupply, come back stronger. But they wouldn't be strong enough. They couldn't be, because they still thought this was about the money, about the hunt, about proving themselves the best. They didn't understand yet that some targets couldn't be bought, some hunts couldn't be won, and some proof came at a price too high to pay. But they would learn, one way or another. They would learn. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, a lonely sound that echoed off the canyon walls like laughter. Eli shouldered his pack and began walking, disappearing into the gathering darkness like a ghost. The first encounter was over. The real hunt was about to begin. The town of Copper Springs lay nestled in a valley, its buildings weathered by time and desert winds. Smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town, where Daniel Sullivan had worked metal for over 30 years. The rhythmic ping of hammer, striking anvil echoed through the quiet streets, a sound as familiar to the townspeople as their own heartbeats. The hammering stopped abruptly as 5 horses approached. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his weathered face hardening as he recognized the riders. Bounty hunters. He'd seen enough of their kind to know the look. "Something I can help you folks with?" he asked, setting down his hammer, but keeping it within reach. Hank Morrison dismounted first, his spurs jingling against the packed earth. "Depends on how cooperative you're feeling, Mr. Sullivan. We're looking for information about Eli Cade." The change in Daniel's expression was subtle, but immediate. His fingers tightened around the hammer's handle. "Never heard of him." "Now that's interesting," Hank said, stepping closer. "Because we have reliable information that says you not only know him, but worked with him during the border wars. Even maintained his rifles, if I'm not mistaken." "Like I said," Daniel replied, his voice cold as iron. "Never heard of him." Benjamin Thompson moved to block the forge's back exit while Diego Ramirez circled around to the side, his hand resting casually on one of his knives. Sarah Mitchell watched the scene unfold with growing unease, noting how the blacksmith's eyes tracked each movement, assessing threats like a soldier would. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, stepping forward before Hank could escalate the situation. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to understand who we're dealing with." Daniel's eyes flickered to her, then back to Hank. "You already think you know who you're dealing with. Got it all figured out, don't you? Another bounty to collect, another notch on your guns." $50,000 says different, Hank replied. "That's the kind of bounty that comes with a story. One way or another, we're going to hear it." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Daniel looked at each of them in turn, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set the hammer down with deliberate care. "You want to know about Eli Cade?" he asked, his voice quiet but intense. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." He gestured to some wooden benches near the forge. "Might as well sit. It's not a short story." The hunters arranged themselves around the forge, the fire casting dancing shadows on their faces. Daniel stoked the flames, more out of habit than necessity. "I met Eli during the second year of the border wars," he began. "I was the regiment's armorer, responsible for keeping the weapons in working order. Eli was different. He didn't just use his rifle. He understood it. Could tell you the exact condition of every component just by the sound it made when fired." He paused, lost in memory. But it wasn't just technical skill. The things he could do with a rifle. "I've been around shooters my whole life, but I'd never seen anything like it. He could judge distance, wind speed, temperature variations, all instinctively. The other soldiers called him the Ghost because he could make shots that seemed impossible. We've heard the stories," Hank interrupted. 17 perfect shots at Fort Mason. Sounds like tall tales to me." Daniel's laugh was bitter. Fort Mason? That wasn't even his most impressive feat. Did you hear about the Battle of Shadow Valley? 300 men pinned down by enemy forces in the high ground. No way in or out without being picked off. Traditional wisdom said it would take an entire battalion to dislodge the enemy position. He pointed to a distant ridge visible through the forge's doorway. Eli took up position on a ridge twice that high. Spent 18 hours there. No food, no water, barely moving. When he was done, he'd picked off 32 enemy sharpshooters and their commanding officers. Shots that curved with the wind, shots that compensated for the Earth's rotation, shots that no human being should have been able to make. He single-handedly turned the tide of the battle. Sarah leaned forward, engrossed despite herself. If he was such a hero, what happened? Why is there a bounty on his head? Daniel's expression darkened. Because he saw things he wasn't supposed to see. Did some digging he wasn't supposed to do. The war, it wasn't what we were told it was. Some of our own commanders were profiting from it, prolonging the fighting for their own gain. Eli gathered evidence, planned to expose it all. Let me guess, Marcus Red Cloud said quietly. The powers that be didn't take kindly to that. They tried to kill him first, Daniel confirmed. When that failed, they tried to discredit him. Planted evidence, false witnesses. Turned him from a hero into a traitor overnight. He barely escaped with his life. Sarah stood abruptly, walking to the forge's doorway. The story was hitting too close to home, making her question everything about their mission. So he's been in hiding ever since? Not hiding, Daniel corrected. Waiting. Building his case. The man you're hunting, he's not running from justice. He's trying to serve it. Hank had heard enough. He stood, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. That's a nice story, old man. Very touching. But $50,000 doesn't lie. Whatever Cade was, he's our target now. As the hunters prepared to leave, Daniel called after them. You saw what he did in the canyon, didn't you? How he disarmed you all without killing anyone. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't mercy. He was measuring you, testing you. Whatever you think this hunt is, I promise you, you're wrong. They mounted their horses, but Sarah lingered behind. Why are you telling us all this? Daniel's eyes met hers. Because someone needs to understand what's really happening here. And you seem like someone who might actually listen. Unknown to them all, a figure watched from the shadow of a distant water tower. Eli Cade lowered his spyglass, satisfied that his old friend had played his part well. The seeds of doubt had been planted, especially in Sarah. Now it was time to nurture them. As the hunters rode out of town, they found their first false trail. Horse tracks leading toward the mountains, deliberately visible in the soft earth. Marcus examined them with professional interest. These are fresh, he said. Can't be more than an hour old. Then we're gaining on him, Hank declared. Mount up. Wait, Sarah protested. After what we just heard, are we sure about this? What if nothing, Hank snapped. The only thing that matters is the bounty. Whatever story that blacksmith fed you doesn't change that. It changes everything, Sarah argued. If Eli is innocent, then let him prove it in court. Hank interrupted. Our job is to bring him in, not judge his case. The argument might have continued, but a rider approached at a gallop, kicking up dust. He reined in hard, producing a sealed envelope. Message for Hank Morrison, the courier announced. From Mr. Whitmore himself. Said it was urgent. Hank tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. His jaw tightened. Mr. Whitmore is concerned about our lack of progress. Says we need to end this quickly, by any means necessary. He's doubling the bounty. $100,000? Diego whispered. Santa Maria. Why the rush? Sarah demanded. What's Whitmore afraid of? Before anyone could answer, Marcus called out from a nearby outcropping. Over here. Found something. They gathered around what appeared to be a natural cave entrance, partially hidden by brush. Inside, they found signs of recent habitation, a bedroll, some supplies, and most importantly, a wooden box tucked into a natural shelf in the rock. Hank pried it open carefully. Inside lay an array of military medals, their brass surfaces still gleaming. Beneath them, a stack of letters and documents, their pages yellow with age. These are commendations, Sarah said, examining the medals. Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star. He's a decorated war hero. Look at this, Marcus said, holding up one of the letters. It's correspondence between Whitmore and someone named General Preston, dated right after the Battle of Shadow Valley. He scanned the contents, his expression growing grave. They're discussing arms shipments to both sides of the conflict. That's impossible, Hank protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Sarah challenged. $100,000 to catch one man? Whitmore's sudden urgency. It all fits with what Daniel told us. The group fell silent, the weight of revelation settling over them. The cave seemed smaller suddenly, the shadows deeper. It doesn't matter, Hank said finally, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. We took the job. We finish it. As they exited the cave, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. None of them noticed the small mirror positioned on a distant ridge, catching the last rays of sunlight. Through his scope, Eli Cade watched them emerge, noting their body language, the growing divisions in their group. The truth was like a seed he knew. Once planted, it would grow on its own, cracking even the hardest foundations. He'd chosen this cave carefully, left exactly the right documents for them to find. Now he just had to wait, let doubt do its work. The hunters mounted up, following the false trail he'd left toward the mountains. Soon they would make camp for the night, each lost in their own thoughts, their certainty shaken by what they'd learned. Eli packed up his observation post with practiced efficiency. The next phase of his plan was ready. By the time the hunters realized the mountain trail was a false lead, he would be in position for his next move. The question wasn't whether they would follow his trail. It was whether they would understand what really awaited them at its end. As darkness fell over the desert, the hunter's campfire glowed in the distance like a fallen star. Eli watched it for a long moment, then turned his horse south, moving silent as a shadow through the gathering night. The past was catching up to all of them now, its secrets rising like ghosts from the desert sand. The hunt was changing, becoming something none of them had expected. Soon they would all have to choose between duty and justice, between money and truth, between what was easy and what was right. But for now, the desert night held its secrets, and Eli Cade rode on, a ghost among shadows, leading his hunters ever deeper into a trap they didn't even know they were in. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hunter's camp as a lone rider approached from the east. The newcomer sat tall in his saddle, his black duster coat catching the desert wind. A pair of matching pearl-handled revolvers hung low on his hips, and a Winchester rifle rested across his saddle. Benjamin Boom Thompson spotted him first. "We've got company," he called out, reaching for his shotgun. "At ease," Hank Morrison replied, recognition crossing his face. "I know who this is." The rider pulled up at the edge of camp, removing his wide-brimmed hat to reveal sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, twisting his mouth into a permanent half-smirk. "Clay Travers," he introduced himself, scanning the group with predatory intensity. "Heard you folks are hunting Eli Cade." Sarah Mitchell felt her hand instinctively move toward her rifle. She'd heard of Clay Travers, everyone in these parts had. He was known for bringing in his bounties dead, usually in pieces. "What's it to you?" Diego Ramirez asked, his fingers dancing near his throwing knives. Clay's laugh was as dry as the desert wind. "Way I hear it, you've been chasing shadows for days now. Maybe you could use someone with my particular set of skills." "We've got all the skills we need," Sarah said firmly. Hank held up his hand, silencing her. "What's your price, Clay?" 20% of the bounty," Clay replied without hesitation. "And I get first shot at Cade when we find him." Benjamin stepped forward, his usually cheerful face tight with concern. "Hank, you can't be serious. This man's a butcher, not a hunter." "What I am," Clay cut in, his voice sharp as a blade, "is successful. Never lost a mark yet. Can you folks say the same?" The tension in the camp was thick enough to cut. Marcus Red Cloud watched the exchange silently, his dark eyes taking in every detail. Sarah moved closer to Benjamin, both of them clearly uncomfortable with this new development. "We need every advantage we can get," Hank said finally. "You're in, Clay. But you follow my lead?" Clay's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Whatever you say, boss." The group broke camp quickly, following Marcus's tracking of Eli's trail. Clay rode slightly apart from the others, whistling an off-key tune that set everyone's teeth on edge. By mid-morning, they reached a small farmstead nestled in a protected valley. A man was working in the fields, and a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney of the modest house. "Let me handle this," Clay said, spurring his horse forward before anyone could object. The farmer straightened up as Clay approached, leaning on his hoe. "Can I help you, mister?" "Message for Hank Morrison," the courier announced. "From Mr. Whitmore himself." Said it was urgent. Hank tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. His jaw tightened. "Mr. Whitmore is concerned about our lack of progress. Says we need to end this quickly, by any means necessary. He's doubling the bounty. $100,000? Diego whispered. "Santa Maria, why the rush?" Sarah demanded. "What's Whitmore afraid of?" Before anyone could answer, Marcus called out from a nearby outcropping. "Over here. Found something." They gathered around what appeared to be a natural cave entrance, partially hidden by brush. Inside, they found signs of recent habitation, a bedroll, some supplies, and most importantly, a wooden box tucked into a natural shelf in the rock. Hank pried it open carefully. Inside lay an array of military medals, their brass surfaces still gleaming. Beneath them, a stack of letters and documents, their pages yellow with age. "These are commendations," Sarah said, examining the medals. "Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star. He's a decorated war hero." "Look at this," Marcus said, holding up one of the letters. "It's correspondence between Whitmore and someone named General Preston, dated right after the Battle of Shadow Valley." He scanned the contents, his expression growing grave. "They're discussing arms shipments to both sides of the conflict." "That's impossible," Hank protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Sarah challenged. $100,000 to catch one man? Whitmore's sudden urgency. "It all fits with what Daniel told us." The group fell silent, the weight of revelation settling over them. The cave seemed smaller suddenly, the shadows deeper. "It doesn't matter," Hank said finally, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "We took the job. We finish it." As they exited the cave, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. None of them noticed the small mirror positioned on a distant ridge, catching the last rays of sunlight. Through his scope, Eli Cade watched them emerge, noting their body language, the growing divisions in their group. The truth was like a seed he knew. Once planted, it would grow on its own, cracking even the hardest foundations. He'd chosen this cave carefully, left exactly the right documents for them to find. Now he just had to wait, let doubt do its work. The hunters mounted up, following the false trail he'd left toward the mountains. Soon they would make camp for the night, each lost in their own thoughts, their certainty shaken by what they'd learned. Eli packed up his observation post with practiced efficiency. The next phase of his plan was ready. By the time the hunters realized the mountain trail was a false lead, he would be in position for his next move. The question wasn't whether they would follow his trail. It was whether they would understand what really awaited them at its end. As darkness fell over the desert, the hunter's campfire glowed in the distance like a fallen star. Eli watched it for a long moment, then turned his horse south, moving silent as a shadow through the gathering night. The past was catching up to all of them now, its secrets rising like ghosts from the desert sand. The hunt was changing, becoming something none of them had expected. Soon they would all have to choose between duty and justice, between money and truth, between what was easy and what was right. But for now, the desert night held its secrets, and Eli Cade rode on, a ghost among shadows, leading his hunters ever deeper into a trap they didn't even know they were in. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hunter's camp as a lone rider approached from the east. The newcomer sat tall in his saddle, his black duster coat catching the desert wind. A pair of matching pearl-handled revolvers hung low on his hips, and a Winchester rifle rested across his saddle. Benjamin Boone Thompson spotted him first. "We've got company," he called out, reaching for his shotgun. "At ease," Hank Morrison replied, recognition crossing his face. "I know who this is." The rider pulled up at the edge of camp, removing his wide-brimmed hat to reveal sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, twisting his mouth into a permanent half-smirk. Clay Travers. He introduced himself, scanning the group with predatory intensity. Heard you folks are hunting Eli Cade. Sarah Mitchell felt her hand instinctively move toward her rifle. She'd heard of Clay Travers, everyone in these parts had. He was known for bringing in his bounties dead, usually in pieces. What's it to you? Diego Ramirez asked, his fingers dancing near his throwing knives. Clay's laugh was as dry as the desert wind. Way I hear it, you've been chasing shadows for days now. Maybe you could use someone with my particular set of skills. We've got all the skills we need, Sarah said firmly. Hank held up his hand, silencing her. What's your price, Clay? 20% of the bounty. Clay replied without hesitation. And I get first shot at Cade when we find him. Benjamin stepped forward, his usually cheerful face tight with concern. Hank, you can't be serious. This man's a butcher, not a hunter. What I am, Clay cut in, his voice sharp as a blade, is successful. Never lost a mark yet. Can you folks say the same? The tension in the camp was thick enough to cut. Marcus Red Cloud watched the exchange silently, his dark eyes taking in every detail. Sarah moved closer to Benjamin, both of them clearly uncomfortable with this new development. We need every advantage we can get, Hank said finally. You're in, Clay. But you follow my lead? Clay's smile didn't reach his eyes. Whatever you say, boss. The group broke camp quickly, following Marcus's tracking of Eli's trail. Clay rode slightly apart from the others, whistling an off-key tune that set everyone's teeth on edge. By mid-morning, they reached a small farmstead nestled in a protected valley. A man was working in the fields, and a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney of the modest house. Let me handle this, Clay said, spurring his horse forward before anyone could object. The farmer straightened up as Clay approached, leaning on his hoe. Can I help you, mister? He's playing with us, Clay snarled, running his finger over the carved letters. No, Sarah replied quietly. He's trying to tell us something. We're just not listening. As they mounted up to continue the hunt, none of them noticed the small mirror flashes from a distant ridge. Eli's way of signaling his network of allies that the next phase of his plan was ready to begin. The hunters rode out, their group now more divided than ever. Clay Travers had brought more than just his skills to their party. He brought a darkness that threatened to consume them all. But darkness, as they would soon learn, was where Eli Cade was most dangerous. For now, the desert sun beat down mercilessly, and the hunters followed their prey's trail, unaware that every step led them deeper into an elaborate trap. Eli watched them go, his rifle ready but unfired. The time for shooting would come soon enough. The real question was whether they would understand the truth before it was too late. Not just about him, but about themselves. About what they were willing to become in pursuit of blood money. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and gunpowder. Somewhere in the distance, a vulture circled lazily, patient and watchful. The day was still young, but already it carried the weight of violence to come. The hunt continued, but with each passing hour, it became less clear who was truly hunting whom. The abandoned mining town of Salvation emerged from the morning mist like a ghost ship on a desert sea. Weathered buildings lined the empty main street, their windows dark and hollow, their paint long since scoured away by wind and sand. The town's name, once proudly displayed on the water tower, now hung crooked and faded, as if even the letters had given up hope. Marcus Red Cloud knelt in the dust at the town's entrance, studying the ground with practiced eyes. Fresh tracks, he announced. Multiple passes through here. He's been moving around the town freely. Almost like he wants us to know he's here, Sarah Mitchell observed, her hand resting uneasily on her rifle. Clay Travers spat into the dust. Then let's not disappoint him. The group spread out as they entered the town, moving from cover to cover. Benjamin Boom Thompson kept close to the building's edges, his expert eyes scanning for tripwires or pressure plates. Diego Ramirez had his throwing knives ready, though they seemed inadequate against the vast emptiness of the abandoned streets. High above them, Eli Cade tracked their movement through his scope. He'd spent weeks preparing this battlefield, learning every sight line, every possible approach. Now he watched as the hunters walked into his carefully laid web. Check the buildings, Hank Morrison ordered. But stay alert. This whole place feels wrong. The group began methodically searching the structures, the creaking of old floorboards and rusty hinges the only sound in the dead town. Benjamin approached the old assay office, his trained eye catching something the others missed. "Hold up," he called out, dropping to one knee. "We got a tripwire, and it's professional work." He traced the nearly invisible wire to its source, enough dynamite to level half the building. "This isn't some prospector's leftover claim marker. This was set recently. Can you disarm it?" Hank asked. Benjamin worked carefully, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Almost got it." The wire went slack in his hands, and he let out a long breath. That was too close. One wrong move and a shot rang out, the bullet striking the ground between Benjamin's feet. He scrambled backward as more shots followed, hurting the group away from the building. "Get to cover," Hank shouted, but Clay had other ideas. "I've had enough of this cat and mouse game." Clay charged toward the nearest building, guns drawn. A bullet caught his hat brim, spinning it off his head. Another kicked up splinters from the doorframe inches from his face. "Clay, get back here," Sarah yelled, but it was too late. Clay burst through the door, guns blazing at shadows. He swept the room, finding nothing but dust and decay. "Come out and face me, you coward." The answer came in the form of a single shot that shattered a window above him, showering him with glass. Clay dove behind an overturned table, his face twisted with rage. From his position in the church bell tower, Eli shifted his aim. The hunter's sharpshooter, Davis, was setting up his rifle on the second floor of the hotel. A good position, if Eli hadn't already accounted for it. The shot cracked out. Davis cried out as the bullet found his thigh, sending him sprawling. His rifle clattered to the floor below. "Davis is hit," Diego called out. "We need to get him out of there." Sarah used the commotion as cover to slip into the old saloon. The interior was dark, the air thick with decades of dust. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed something odd about the bar's surface. Fresh marks where something had recently been moved. Behind the bar, she found a leather map case and a notebook. The map showed the surrounding territory, with detailed notes about the hunter's movements over the past weeks. Every campsite, every rest stop, every water source they'd used was marked with precise coordinates. "He's been tracking us the whole time," she whispered. "Everything we've done, everywhere we've gone. He knew." The notebook contained something even more disturbing: detailed profiles of each hunter, including information that could only have come from long-term surveillance. Their habits, their preferred tactics, their weaknesses, all carefully documented. Looking for something? Sarah spun around, rifle raised, but the saloon was empty. Eli's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Why are you here, Sarah?" the voice continued. "You're not like the others. I can see it in how you move, how you think. You're not a killer." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Show yourself." "You've seen the evidence by now," Eli's voice replied. "You know this isn't what you were told it was. So, why are you still hunting me?" Before Sarah could respond, Clay's voice boomed from outside. "I'm taking charge of this operation. Morrison's leadership has failed us." Sarah moved to the window, watching the confrontation unfold in the street. Clay stood face to face with Hank, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Stand down, Clay," Hank warned. "Or what?" Clay sneered. "You'll add me to your list of failures? We're done following your careful plans. It's time for action." The tension was broken by a sudden burst of gunfire from multiple directions. The hunters dove for cover as bullets struck their supply packs, water canteens, and ammunition pouches with surgical precision. "He's everywhere," Diego shouted. "No," Sarah realized. "He's nowhere. These positions were preset. He's shooting from different locations remotely." The attack ended as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the hunters with ruined supplies and shattered confidence. As darkness fell over Salvation, the group retreated to the relative safety of the hotel's ground floor. "We're running low on water," Benjamin reported. "Food too. If we don't resupply soon." "We're not leaving," Clay insisted. "This ends here." Sarah was about to argue when she noticed something on the wall. Words painted in what looked like fresh blood. "Turn back now, or none of you leave alive." The message gleamed wetly in the fading light, a crimson warning that seemed to pulse with each breath. The hunters stared at it in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "It's not blood," Benjamin said finally, touching the liquid. "Paint mixed with phosphorus. It'll glow after dark." But the psychological effect had already taken hold. In the growing darkness, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every creak of the old buildings became a potential attack. Eli watched from his hidden perch as the hunters huddled in their defensive position. They were running low on supplies, their sharpshooter was wounded, and tensions within the group were reaching a breaking point. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He adjusted his scope, focusing on Sarah as she stood watch by a window. She was different from the others. There was intelligence in her eyes, a questioning spirit that set her apart. She'd found his message, seen the evidence he'd planted. Now he just had to wait and see what she'd do with it. The night settled over Salvation like a burial shroud. The hunters took turns at watch, jumping at every sound that echoed through the empty streets. None of them slept soundly, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, Eli Cade was watching, waiting, planning his next move. Clay paced restlessly, his boots raising dust with each step. The facade of control he'd maintained was cracking, revealing the desperation beneath. "Come morning, we burn this town to the ground if we have to. Smoke him out like a rat. And kill us all in the process," Sarah challenged. "This whole town is rigged with explosives. One wrong move and—" "Quiet," Marcus hissed suddenly. Everyone froze, straining to hear what had caught the tracker's attention. In the distance, a piano note rang out, a single, clear tone that seemed to hang in the air forever. Then another, and another, forming a slow, mournful melody that drifted through the empty streets. "The saloon piano," Benjamin whispered. "But how?" "He's playing with us," Clay snarled. "I'm going to—" "You're going to stay right here," Hank ordered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The music continued, each note a reminder that they were in Eli's territory now, playing by his rules. The phosphorus-painted warning on the wall began to glow as promised, casting an eerie red light over their faces. Sarah moved away from the group, her mind racing. Everything about the situation felt wrong. They weren't hunters closing in on their prey. They were mice being toyed with by a cat, being herded exactly where Eli wanted them. As if reading her thoughts, a piece of paper fluttered down from somewhere above. Sarah caught it before it could hit the ground. The message was simple. "Why are you really here, Sarah? What's worth dying for?" She crumpled the note in her fist, but the questions remained, echoing in her mind like the ghostly piano notes that still drifted through the night air. The hunters had walked into the lion's den, thinking themselves the predators. Now, as they huddled in the darkness of a dead town, surrounded by traps and watched by unseen eyes, the truth was becoming clear. They weren't the hunters at all. They were the hunted. Dawn crept over the abandoned town of Salvation, revealing the toll the night had taken on the hunters. Their supplies, already running low, had somehow diminished even further during the darkness. Clay Travers stood in the shadow of the old hotel, watching as Benjamin Boom Thompson examined their food cache with growing concern. "Half our provisions are spoiled," Benjamin announced, holding up a water-damaged bag of cornmeal. "Must have been the leak in the roof." "There was no leak," Sarah Mitchell interrupted, examining the supplies herself. "The damage was too precise, too targeted. Water had somehow been introduced to specific containers while others remained perfectly dry." Her eyes flickered to Clay, who merely smiled and walked away, whistling softly. The morning air was crisp as Sarah ventured to the outskirts of town to check their defensive positions. The events of the previous day, the traps, the shooting, the ghostly piano music, had left everyone on edge. As she rounded an abandoned mine entrance, a soft whimpering caught her attention. In a small clearing, she found a rabbit caught in a wire snare. The creature thrashed weakly, its leg bleeding where the wire had cut into it. Sarah moved forward slowly, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "Careful," a quiet voice said behind her. "Those traps can be tricky." Sarah spun around, her hand flying to her pistol. Eli Cade stood there, his rifle pointed at the ground. His appearance was so sudden, so casual, that for a moment she could only stare. "You could shoot me," he said calmly. "But then who would help the rabbit?" Sarah's hand remained on her weapon, but she didn't draw. "Why are you here?" Instead of answering, Eli moved slowly past her and knelt by the trapped animal. His movements were deliberate, non-threatening. With practiced hands, he began working to free the rabbit from the snare. The trick, he explained as if giving a lesson, is to remain calm. Panic only makes the trap bite deeper. His eyes met hers briefly, and she knew he wasn't just talking about the rabbit. Together, they worked to free the creature. Sarah watched as Eli's supposedly deadly hands gently cradled the injured animal, checking its wounds before releasing it. The rabbit bounded away into the brush, leaving them in an unexpected moment of peace. "You don't belong with them, Sarah," Eli said quietly, still looking after the rabbit. "You're not like Clay, or even Hank. You still question things." "You don't know me," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know you better than you think. I've been watching all of you." He turned to face her fully. "Ask yourself, why are you really here? What do you really know about this hunt?" Before she could respond, a distant shout broke the moment. Eli melted away into the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. When she returned to town, Hank Morrison was waiting. His eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the dust on her knees from kneeling by the rabbit, the troubled expression she couldn't quite hide. "Found anything interesting out there?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just checking the perimeter," she replied, walking past him. "Funny," he said to her back, "how you always seem to be alone when something happens." The morning wore on, tension building like a thunderhead. Diego Ramirez, confident in his skills with his throwing knives, decided to scout the old church alone despite warnings from the others. "I work better solo," he declared, twirling a blade between his fingers. "Besides, what's one man going to do against?" He never finished the sentence. A shot rang out, not aimed at him, but at the ground near his feet. Diego dove for cover, rolling to his feet with knives ready. Another shot knocked one blade from his hand, then another, and another, until he was completely disarmed. "Come out and face me," Diego shouted, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. The answer came in the form of a rope that suddenly coiled around his ankles, yanking him off his feet. Before he could react, he was dragged into an alley, cursing in Spanish the whole way. The group found him an hour later, tied expertly to a chair in the middle of the street, his precious knives arranged in a circle around him, just out of reach. Clay saw his opportunity in the chaos that followed. "This is what happens when we play it safe," he announced, his voice carrying across the street. "We need to take action, take control. Morrison's leadership has failed us all." Hank stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "Watch yourself, Clay." "Or what?" Clay's smile was all teeth. "You'll fail at stopping me like you've failed at everything else. Face it, you're not cut out for this anymore." The two men faced each other in the dusty street, the rest of the group watching with bated breath. The scene might have ended in bloodshed if Sarah hadn't stepped between them. "Enough," she shouted. "Before anyone else gets hurt or humiliated, I want the truth, Hank. The real truth." "This isn't the time," Hank began, but Sarah cut him off. "It's exactly the time. Why are we really here? What did Whitmore hire you to do?" The silence stretched out like a drawn bowstring. Finally, Hank's shoulders sagged slightly. "Whitmore doesn't want Cade captured," he admitted. "He wants him silenced. Permanently. There are things Cade knows, things that could ruin powerful people." The admission hung in the air like gunsmoke. Benjamin was the first to move, stepping away from Hank to stand beside Sarah. "So we're not bounty hunters," he said quietly. "We're assassins. We're whatever we're paid to be," Clay interjected with a laugh. Sarah's hand tightened on her rifle. "Not all of us." She looked at Benjamin. "Are you with me?" Benjamin nodded without hesitation. Together, they backed away from the others, making their position clear. "Anyone who wants to walk away from this madness, now's the time," Sarah announced. The group fractured like broken glass. Marcus Red Cloud hesitated, then moved to join Sarah and Benjamin. Diego, still smarting from his humiliation, stayed with Hank. Clay stood apart, watching it all with predatory interest. As the two groups separated, taking up positions on opposite sides of the street, none of them noticed the absence of their wounded sharpshooter, Davis. The man had been moved to the doctor's office after being shot, but now the building stood empty. High above the town, In the abandoned mine overseer's office, Eli sat across from a bound but unharmed Davis. The sharpshooter's leg wound had been properly cleaned and bandaged. "Tell me about Whitmore," Eli said quietly. "Tell me what you know." Davis licked his dry lips. "He's scared of you. Not just of what you can do with a rifle, but of what you know. He's been paying off officials, selling weapons to both sides of conflicts. The bounty, it's just a cover. He wants you dead before you can testify. And the others? Do they know? Hank does now. Clay. Clay just wants the money and the killing. The rest, they're just following orders." A noise from outside drew their attention. Clay Travers stood in the doorway, his guns already drawn. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he drawled. Eli was already moving, but Clay's guns weren't aimed at him. 2 shots rang out, and Davis slumped in his chair, dead before Eli could reach him. "Can't have you spreading stories," Clay said to the corpse. Then he fired at where Eli had been, but the sharpshooter was already gone, leaving Clay shooting at shadows. The gunshots echoed across the town. From their position near the hotel, Sarah and Benjamin heard them clearly. Then Clay's voice carried down from the mine office. "Found your little friend Davis. Shame about the accident." Sarah felt sick. She'd known Clay was dangerous, but this was something else. The man wasn't just ruthless. He was enjoying this. "We have to end this," Benjamin said quietly. "Before anyone else dies." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She thought about the rabbit, about Eli's gentle hands freeing it from the trap, about how he'd had countless opportunities to kill them all, but had chosen not to, about the evidence they'd found of corruption and betrayal. They'd come to this ghost town thinking they were hunting a dangerous man. Now they were caught between a principled fighter and a genuine monster, and Sarah finally knew which side she needed to be on. The sun climbed higher over Salvation, its heat rippling off the empty buildings. The town had become a battlefield, but not the kind any of them had expected. It wasn't just about capturing a bounty anymore. It was about choosing sides in a war between justice and corruption, between conscience and greed. Clay's laughter echoed through the streets, a sound as dry and merciless as the desert wind. He was no longer pretending to be anything but what he was, a killer who had found his perfect playground. Somewhere in the maze of buildings and shadows, Eli Cade watched it all unfold. The pieces were in place, the lines were drawn, and the real game was about to begin. The hunters had become the hunted, the trusted had become traitors, and the truth was finally emerging into the harsh desert light. The ghost town of Salvation waited silently, ready to witness the final act of a drama that had been years in the making. Before the sun set again, blood would stain its dusty streets, and not everyone who walked them now would live to see another dawn. In the quiet of his fortified position, Eli Cade cleaned his rifle with practiced precision, each movement automatic after years of repetition. As he worked, his mind drifted back to that fateful day 5 years ago, the day everything changed. The memory was crystal clear. The polished wood of Whitmore's office, the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows, the feeling of his dress uniform collar too tight against his throat. He'd been summoned immediately upon returning from his last mission, still dusty from the trail. "Captain Cade," Whitmore had said, not looking up from his papers. "I understand you've been asking questions about our supply lines." "Yes, sir," Eli had replied. "There are discrepancies in the manifests. Weapons that never reached our troops, supplies that vanished en route." Whitmore had finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes cold as a snake's. "Tell me, Captain, do you enjoy your position? The respect it brings? The way it's helped you put your humble beginnings behind you?" The threat had been clear even then, but Eli had pressed on. "Sir, I've found evidence of weapons being sold to both sides. Someone's profiting from prolonging this conflict. Someone always profits from war, Captain. The smart ones ensure they're on the profitable side." Eli had placed his evidence on the desk. Carefully gathered documents, witness statements, shipping records. "This is to stop, sir. I'm taking this to the federal authorities." Whitmore's smile had been terrible to behold. "I'm afraid I can't allow that." He'd pulled a document from his desk. "You see, we've uncovered evidence of your own corruption. Weapon sales, bribes, collaboration with the enemy. All very well documented. That's impossible. Quite possible, actually. Amazing what the right signatures can prove." Whitmore had leaned forward. You have two choices, Captain. Disappear quietly, or face a military tribunal with evidence provided by multiple credible witnesses. Either way, your reputation is finished. The memory faded as Eli finished reassembling his rifle. He'd chosen a third option, to fight back. It had cost him everything, but he'd never regretted it. Not even now. Across town, Sarah Mitchell knelt beside Davis's body in the doctor's office, her hands shaking as she went through his belongings. His death at Clay's hands still burned in her mind, driving her to understand why. In Davis's jacket pocket, she found a collection of letters, their pages worn from frequent handling. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. They were correspondence between Whitmore and various officials, discussing arms deals, bribes, and the need to silence anyone who threatened to expose their operation. One letter in particular stood out, dated just before Eli's accusation. Cade is becoming a problem. Too honest for his own good. Fortunately, we've prepared evidence that will discredit him completely. Once he's branded a traitor, no one will believe his accusations. Sarah. Benjamin's urgent whisper made her look up. Clay's on the move. He's acting strange, stranger than usual. Through the window, they watched Clay stalking through the town's empty streets, his guns drawn, muttering to himself. The man's obsession with killing Eli had clearly pushed him over some mental edge. Comes down to him and me, Clay was saying, his voice carrying in the still air. Always knew it would. Greatest gunfight in history. They'll tell stories about it for years. Deep beneath the town, Eli moved through the mining tunnels he'd spent years preparing. The old support beams had been reinforced, create drops established, sight lines calculated. This would be his final battleground, one way or another. He'd chosen this place carefully. The mine's main tunnel connected to a network of smaller shafts, all carefully mapped and memorized. He'd stored supplies, ammunition, and emergency medical equipment at strategic points. The very ground beneath Salvation was honeycombed with his preparations. Above ground, Benjamin Boone Thompson found himself facing a moral choice. He discovered one of Clay's crude explosive traps, dynamite rigged to collapse a building when Eli entered it. The blast would likely kill anyone nearby, friend or foe. Looking around to ensure he wasn't observed, Benjamin carefully disarmed the trap. As he worked, he thought about everything they'd learned, about the difference between justice and revenge. His expertise had always been breaking things down, but maybe now it was time to help build something up like the truth. Sarah made her decision. With a white handkerchief tied to a stick, she walked slowly into the center of town. Eli, she called out. I want to talk. Minutes passed in tense silence. Finally, Eli's voice came from somewhere above. Talk. I know the truth about Whitmore. About why he wants you dead. We want to help you expose him. We? Myself and Benjamin. Maybe others. Help us bring Whitmore to justice. And we'll help keep you alive long enough to testify. More silence, then. Meet me at the mine entrance. Come alone. As Sarah walked toward the meeting point, Hank Morrison stepped out of the shadows, his face haggard. Wait, he said, raising his empty hands when she reached for her gun. There's something you need to know. More lies, Hank? No. The truth, finally. He slumped against the wall. I knew about Whitmore's corruption from the start. Knew Eli was innocent. But Whitmore, he has my family under surveillance. Made it clear what would happen if I didn't play along. So you agreed to murder an innocent man? I agreed to try. Figured maybe I could pull my shots, give him a chance to escape. Convince Whitmore I'd done my best. He laughed bitterly. Fool's thinking. A shot rang out, and Hank dove aside as splinters exploded from the wall behind him. Eli stepped into view, his rifle aimed steadily at Hank's chest. Give me one reason, Eli said quietly. No reason, Hank replied, staying very still. Do what you need to do. Just my family. Eli's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. Get out of Salvation. Take your family and run, far from Whitmore's reach. If I ever see you again, you won't. Hank backed away slowly, then turned and walked out of town without looking back. Sarah watched him go, then turned to Eli. Now what? Now we end this. All of it. Eli shouldered his rifle. But first, we need to deal with Clay. He's rigging the whole area with explosives, trying to force a confrontation. He's lost his mind, Benjamin said, joining them. Keeps talking about making history, about the greatest gunfight ever fought. Then let's make sure it's the last gunfight. Eli led them into the mine entrance. I've prepared for this. We can use the tunnels to outmaneuver him, get to Whitmore's evidence before Clay brings the whole town down around us. As they moved deeper into the mine, Sarah shared what she'd found in Davis's belongings. Eli examined the letters carefully. This is it, he said. Proof of everything. The weapons deals, the bribes, the frame-up. With this and my own evidence, we can bring Whitmore down legally. Assuming we survive Clay, Benjamin pointed out. Above them, they heard explosions as Clay began collapsing buildings, trying to force them into the open. The madman's laughter echoed down the mine shaft. Come out, Clay shouted. Time to make history, Eli. Time to see who's really the best. Dust and pebbles rained down as the explosions continued. Benjamin studied the tunnel ceiling with professional concern. He keeps this up, he'll bring down the whole mine system, he warned. We need to stop him fast. Eli nodded, his expression grim. Then let's finish this. Sarah, you and Benjamin head to the south tunnel. It leads to where I've stored the bulk of my evidence. Get it ready for transport. He checked his rifle one last time. I'll deal with Clay. Eli, wait. Sarah caught his arm. You don't have to face him alone. We can help. Some things have to be faced alone. He met her eyes. But I'm glad to have allies again. Been a long time. The tunnel shook with another explosion, closer this time. Clay's voice carried down to them, filled with manic glee. Running out of time, Eli. Running out of places to hide. Go, Eli told them. Whatever happens up there, get that evidence to the federal authorities. Make sure Whitmore pays for everything he's done. Sarah and Benjamin moved quickly through the tunnels, guided by Eli's detailed instructions. Behind them, they heard Eli moving in the opposite direction, heading up toward his final confrontation with Clay. The ghost town of Salvation trembled above them as Clay's explosions continued, each blast bringing them closer to a confrontation that would change everything. The truth had finally come to light, but whether it would survive the coming battle remained to be seen. Above ground, Clay Travers planted his final charges, his eyes wild with anticipation. The greatest gunfight in history was about to begin, and he intended to write its ending in blood and fire. In the tunnels below, Eli Cade moved like a shadow through his underground fortress, preparing to face a mad dog who needed to be put down. The truth about Whitmore would come out, one way or another. But first, he had an appointment with Clay Travers and the judgment of hot lead and cold steel. The ghost town of Salvation shuddered as the first explosion ripped through the morning air. Deep in the mining tunnels, Sarah Mitchell and Benjamin Boone Thompson felt the ground shake beneath their feet as Clay's charges began to detonate in sequence. He's collapsing the tunnels, Benjamin shouted over the rumbling. We need to move. Eli Cade appeared from a side passage, moving with urgent purpose. This way. There's a reinforced shaft that leads to the surface. They ran through the darkness, guided by Eli's intimate knowledge of the tunnel system. Behind them, support beams groaned and cracked as the explosions continued. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Almost there, Eli called back. Just a few more. The tunnel ahead collapsed in a thunderous cascade of rock and timber. They skidded to a stop, trapped between the cave-in and the approaching destruction. Here. Eli kicked open a hidden door in the tunnel wall. Maintenance shaft. Move. They squeezed through the narrow opening, just as the main tunnel collapsed behind them. The shaft angled upward steeply, leading them toward daylight. They emerged into the morning sun, coughing and covered in dust, but alive. Welcome to the party. Clay Travers's voice rang out across the town square. He stood in front of the old bank building, both revolvers drawn, his face split in a maniacal grin. Been waiting for you, Eli. Eli pushed Sarah and Benjamin toward cover. Get to safety. This ends between him and me. Clay's laughter echoed off the buildings. The legendary Eli Cade, the ghost of Fort Mason, the hero who became a traitor. You don't know anything about what really happened, Eli replied, his voice steady. I know enough. Clay began pacing, his spurs jingling with each step. No, you're just a man who got too big for his boots. Started thinking he could change things, make a difference. His smile turned cruel. How'd that work out for you? Better than you think. Eli moved into the street, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. Last chance, Clay. Walk away. Walk away. Clay's eyes were fever-bright. From the greatest gunfight in history? From my chance to prove I'm better than the famous Eli Cade. He shook his head. No, this is where legends are made. The tension stretched like a drawn bowstring. Townsfolk who had been hiding in nearby buildings peered out windows and around corners, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Draw whenever you're ready, Clay taunted. Show me what made you so special. The next few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. Clay's hands hovered over his revolvers. Eli stood perfectly still, his rifle still pointed at the ground. Clay moved first, his draw blindingly fast. But Eli was faster. His rifle came up and fired in one fluid motion. Clay's right revolver went spinning away, a precise shot having struck it just behind the trigger guard. Before Clay could fire his remaining gun, another shot knocked it from his grip. Both shots had been perfect, disarming without killing. Impossible, Clay whispered, staring at his empty hands. No, Eli replied. Just practice. Clay's face contorted with rage. He reached for a hidden detonator in his coat. If I can't beat you, I'll bury us both. I wouldn't, Benjamin called out, holding up a handful of wires. Been a busy morning disabling your toys. Clay screamed in frustration, and then fell silent as the sound of approaching horses filled the air. A group of riders entered the town, led by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Whitmore, Eli said quietly. James Whitmore dismounted, straightening his jacket as his men spread out behind him. I had hoped to find this matter resolved, he said, his cultured voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I'm disappointed, Clay. Wasn't my fault. Clay protested. He's not human. The way he shoots. Silence. Whitmore cut him off with a gesture. Captain Cade. It's been a long time. Not long enough. Eli's rifle hadn't moved. Though your timing is perfect. Makes it easier to expose everything at once. Expose? Whitmore's laugh was practiced, theatrical. My dear Captain, who would believe the accusations of a proven traitor? They'll believe this. Sarah stepped forward, holding up the letters they'd found. Documentation of your weapons deals. Proof of bribes. Evidence of how you framed Eli. All in your own words, with your own signature. Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. Where did you get those? Found them in Davis's belongings, Sarah replied. After Clay murdered him. The townsfolk who had been watching began to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by the confrontation. They gathered at the edges of the street, murmuring as Sarah read excerpts from the letters. You armed both sides of the border war, she announced, her voice carrying to the growing crowd. Prolonged the fighting to increase your profits. And when Eli discovered the truth, you tried to destroy him. Lies, Whitmore snarled, but the crowd's murmuring had turned angry. My brother died in that war, someone shouted. 3 years of fighting that could have ended sooner. Whitmore began backing toward his horse. This is absurd. I am a respected businessman. You're a war profiteer, Eli stated flatly. And now everyone knows it. Whitmore's mask of civility fell away completely. He drew a derringer from his coat pocket. Kill them. Kill them all. But his men stood motionless, looking at the angry crowd, at the evidence in Sarah's hands, at Eli's unwavering rifle. They knew which way the wind was blowing. Whitmore turned to run, but found his path blocked by Benjamin and Sarah, their weapons ready. It's over, Sarah said. Whitmore raised his derringer with shaking hands. I will not be ruined by. The shot came so fast that most observers didn't even see Eli move. The derringer went flying from Whitmore's grip, a precise shot having split it nearly in half. That's enough killing, Eli said quietly. The crowd surged forward, several men moving to restrain Whitmore. Others began calling for the sheriff, for telegrams to be sent to federal authorities. But the drama wasn't quite over. Clay Travers, forgotten in the chaos, had managed to recover one of his revolvers. With a roar of hatred, he raised it toward Eli's back. Sarah saw him first. Without hesitation, she swung her rifle around and fired. The shot caught Clay in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. His revolver clattered away across the wooden sidewalk. Good shot, Eli commented. Sarah smiled grimly. I had a good teacher. As Whitmore and Clay were being taken into custody, the townspeople gathered around Eli. Many remembered the border war, had lost friends and family to the artificially prolonged conflict. Their anger at Whitmore's betrayal was palpable. The federal authorities will want to hear your testimony, Benjamin told Eli. All of it, Eli nodded, watching as Whitmore was led away. 5 years of gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment, finally paid off. What will you do now? Sarah asked. Before Eli could answer, a commotion broke out. Clay had somehow slipped his bonds and grabbed a knife from one of his guards. He charged toward Eli with a howl of rage. Sarah's rifle cracked one final time. Clay stumbled, then collapsed face first in the dust. This time, he didn't get up. Guess that answers the question of who's better, Benjamin remarked. The morning sun climbed higher over Salvation as federal marshals began arriving, drawn by urgent telegrams. They found a town awakening from a long nightmare, its people eager to share what they had witnessed. Whitmore sat in a hastily arranged cell, his fine suit covered in dust, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Outside, reporters were already gathering, sensing a story that would shake the territory to its foundations. Clay's body was carried to the undertakers, his dreams of legendary status dying with him. In the end, he had become just another cautionary tale about the difference between skill and wisdom, between ambition and honor. Sarah stood with Eli as he surveyed the town that had become his final battleground. You could have killed them both, she observed. Clay and Whitmore. No one would have blamed you. Enough people have died because of Whitmore's greed, Eli replied. Time for justice to have its turn. The ghost town of Salvation seemed to breathe easier, as if a curse had been lifted. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the chance for real justice. The legend of Eli Cade would live on, but not as a story of revenge or violence. Instead, it would be remembered as a tale of patience and principle, of a man who chose justice over vengeance, who proved that the best shot isn't always the one that kills. The morning wind picked up, carrying away the last traces of smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in the history of the American West. The federal courthouse in Denver hummed with anticipation as James Whitmore was led into the courtroom in chains. His once immaculate suit had been replaced by prison garb, his commanding presence diminished by 3 weeks in custody. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Letters, ledgers, witness testimonies, all painting a picture of corruption that stretched back years. Eli Cade sat in the gallery beside Sarah Mitchell, watching as his former superior was brought before the judge. The trial had been swift, the verdict unanimous. Now came the moment of justice he'd waited 5 years to see. James Whitmore, the judge intoned, his voice filling the crowded courtroom. You have been found guilty of corruption, weapons trafficking, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The evidence presented by Captain Eli Cade and corroborated by multiple witnesses leaves no doubt as to your crimes. Whitmore stood rigid, his face a mask of barely contained rage as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court officially exonerates Captain Eli Cade of all charges previously leveled against him. His actions in exposing your criminal enterprise are to be commended, not condemned. The gallery erupted in applause. Eli remained still, but Sarah could see the slight tremor in his hands, the only outward sign of the emotion he felt as 5 years of exile and persecution finally ended. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Eli, hungry for details of the story that had captivated the territory. He answered their questions with characteristic brevity, deflecting praise and focusing on the facts. But he couldn't stop them from writing what they saw. A hero vindicated, a legend proven true. Later that evening, in a quiet Denver saloon, the remaining members of the hunting party gathered for one last time. Hank Morrison nursed a whiskey, his face lined with the weight of his decisions. I'm done with hunting, he announced. Bought a small ranch up in Montana. Time to start fresh, away from all this. Benjamin Boom, Thompson nodded in understanding. My sister's been asking me to help with her store in California. Might be nice to build things up instead of blowing them apart for a change. Sarah listened to their plans, thinking about her own future. The Town Council of Salvation, had approached her earlier that day with an unexpected offer. "They want me to be sheriff," she told the others. "Say they need someone who understands the difference between law and justice." "You'll do well," Eli said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken all evening. The conversation turned to Clay Travers. The man had survived Sarah's shot, only to face a different kind of death, the death of his reputation. No one would hire a bounty hunter who had sided with corruption over justice. Last they'd heard, he'd been seen heading south toward Mexico, a broken man running from his own shame. As the evening wore on, the group began to drift apart. Handshakes and hugs were exchanged. Promises to right were made. They had started as hunters and prey, but ended as something closer to family. Days later, back in Salvation, Eli stood on the porch of his cabin in the hills overlooking the town. The wanted posters had all been taken down, replaced by newspaper articles telling the true story. But he found he had no desire to return to his old life, to the uniforms and ceremonies and politics. "Thought I might find you up here," Sarah's voice came from behind him. She rode up on her new sheriff's horse, a badge glinting on her vest. "Town keeping you busy?" Eli asked. "Getting there." Whitmore's arrest opened up a lot of opportunities. Banks offering loans to honest businesses now, railways talking about adding a stop. She dismounted, joining him on the porch. "Could use your help, you know. Deputy positions open." Eli smiled but shook his head. "I've had enough of badges and authority. Time for someone else to wear the star. Will you stay in the area at least? These hills suit me." He gestured to the wilderness beyond his cabin. "Plenty of peace and quiet. Good sight lines, too." Sarah laughed at that. Still the sharpshooter. Some things don't change. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the town below. Salvation was transforming under Sarah's leadership. New buildings were going up, families moving in, businesses opening. The ghost town was coming back to life. "I never properly thanked you," Sarah said finally. "Not just for helping expose Whitmore, but for teaching me to question things, to look deeper. You already had those instincts. You just needed permission to trust them." Sarah nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. That sometimes the greatest lessons come from learning to trust your own judgment. "The stories about you are spreading," she told him. "Every saloon from here to Kansas City has someone telling tales about the sharpshooter who could shoot around corners and judge the Earth's rotation. Let them talk. Legends have their uses. Might make the next Whitmore think twice." As the sun began to set, Sarah mounted up to return to town. "You'll always have a place down there if you want it," she said. "I know. But for now, this is where I belong." She rode away, leaving Eli to the solitude he'd grown to prefer. The quiet life suited him. Days spent hunting, practicing his marksmanship, watching over the town from afar. He had no desire to be the center of attention, to wear a badge or accept accolades. The stories would spread on their own, growing with each retelling. How Eli Cade had outshot the fastest guns in the territory. How he'd brought down a corrupt empire with patience and precision. How he could make shots that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. Some would say he could shoot faster than lightning, others that he could hit a target without even looking at it. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. But Eli was content to let the legend grow while he lived the reality. Weeks turned to months. Salvation prospered under Sarah's guidance, becoming a model of frontier justice and opportunity. Benjamin wrote from California about his new life, helping run his sister's store. Hank's letters from Montana spoke of peace finally found in the simple life of ranching. And Eli watched it all from his hilltop sanctuary, his rifle never far from reach. Not out of paranoia or fear, but out of the same dedication to excellence that had always driven him. Each morning, he would practice his craft, sending bullets through distant targets with surgical precision. The routine brought him peace, checking wind speed and direction, calculating distance and drop, accounting for all the variables that turned a good shot into an impossible one. It was meditation with gunpowder, prayer with lead and brass. One crisp autumn morning, a young boy from town made the trek up to Eli's cabin, drawn by the stories he'd heard. He found the sharpshooter at his daily practice, watching in awe as Eli split a playing card edge on at 300 yards. "Could you teach me to shoot like that?" the boy asked. Eli studied him for a long moment. "Why do you want to learn?" "To be famous. To be the best." "Wrong reasons," Eli replied. Come back when you want to learn for the right ones. The boy left confused, but Eli knew he'd be back. They always came back, drawn by the legend but staying for the truth. And maybe that was his real purpose now, not just to be a guardian, but a teacher. Someone who could show others the difference between using a skill and mastering it, between seeking glory and seeking justice. As the sun climbed higher, Eli lined up another shot. The rifle settled against his shoulder like an old friend. He breathed out slowly, letting the world narrow to this one perfect moment of focus and clarity. The shot rang out across the valley, clear and true as a bell announcing a new day. Below, the town of Salvation went about its business, safe under the watch of its hidden guardian. And up on his hill, Eli Cade allowed himself a small smile. He was no longer a wanted man, no longer a hunter or hunted. He was simply himself, a master of his craft, a keeper of truth, a silent protector of justice. The legend would live on in stories told around saloon tables and campfires, but the reality was here, in the perfect alignment of eye and hand and heart. The wind shifted slightly, and Eli adjusted his aim for the next shot. There would always be more targets, more challenges, more moments of perfect focus to find. But now he faced them not out of necessity or revenge, but out of choice, out of love for the art itself. And that, perhaps, was the greatest justice of all. 10 years later, in the warm light of an oil lamp, Sarah Mitchell sat at her desk in the Salvation Sheriff's office, pen moving steadily across paper as she wrote. Dear Eli, time has a way of changing things, doesn't it? 10 years since those fateful days in Salvation, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times, it feels like a story someone else told me. The town has grown in ways we never imagined. Remember that dusty main street where we had our final showdown with Clay? It's now lined with proper businesses, a school, a doctor's office, even a small library. Children play where once only tumbleweeds dared to roll. Your legacy lives on here, though most newcomers don't know the full story. They see the prosperity, the sense of justice that pervades our community, but they don't know about the man who made it possible. The man who taught me that true strength isn't in how fast you can draw or how straight you can shoot, but in knowing when not to pull the trigger at all. I still catch glimpses of you sometimes, watching over us from those hills you love so much. The townspeople speak of a guardian angel with a rifle, and I smile, knowing the truth is better than any legend. High up in his cabin, Eli Cade carefully folded Sarah's letter and placed it in an old wooden box alongside his war medals. Each piece told part of his story: the Distinguished Service Cross speaking of valor, the Silver Star of Courage under fire, and now this letter of redemption and legacy. He ran his fingers over the medals, remembering the weight they'd once carried. Now they served a different purpose, not as symbols of military glory, but as reminders of the path that had led him here. A commotion in town drew his attention to the window. Through his scope, he watched a scene unfold in front of the saloon. A young man, barely out of his teens, was asking loud questions about the legendary Eli Cade. Sarah, her hair now streaked with silver, but her stance still commanding, confronted the youth. You're not the first to come looking for him, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. And you won't be the last. But take my advice. Leave the legend alone. But the stories they tell, the young gunslinger protested. They say he could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 paces, that he could curve bullets around corners. And what would you do with such knowledge? Sarah asked. On more bounties? Make a name for yourself. She shook her head. The real lesson of Eli Cade isn't about how well he could shoot. It's about why he chose not to. The young man left, chastened but thoughtful. Eli lowered his scope, a small smile playing at his lips. Sarah had learned well. In the next town over, Benjamin Thompson watched his sister's children practice with their small rifles. 10-year-old Emily and 12-year-old James lined up their shots carefully, remembering the stories their uncle had told them about the greatest marksman in the West. Remember what I taught you, Benjamin said. It's not about being the fastest or the deadliest. It's about responsibility, about understanding the weight of what you're doing. Like Eli Cade? Emily asked, adjusting her stance the way she'd been taught. Exactly like Eli Cade. The children had never met the legendary sharpshooter, but his principles lived on in their careful approach to marksmanship in their understanding that a gun was a tool of last resort, not first choice. In the territorial prison, James Whitmore faced his final judgment. The years had not been kind to him. His hair had gone completely white, his once proud bearing reduced to a prisoner's shuffle. As the judge read out his extended sentence for additional crimes uncovered during his imprisonment, Whitmore finally showed a glimmer of understanding. "The money's gone," he whispered to his lawyer. "The power, the connections, all gone. And for what? Because I couldn't let one honest man speak the truth." Miles away, in a small border town, a weather-beaten man sat alone in a cantina. Clay Travers was barely recognizable from the dangerous gunslinger he'd once been. The wound in his shoulder had never healed properly, leaving him with a permanent stiffness that served as a constant reminder of his hubris. But something had changed in him over the years. The locals knew him as a quiet man who sometimes helped travelers in trouble, who stepped in when the local children were being bullied. He never spoke of his past, but sometimes, when he heard travelers telling tales of Eli Cade, a thoughtful look would cross his face. The legend of Eli Cade had taken on a life of its own. In saloons across the territory, stories were told of his impossible shots, his unwavering principles, his role in bringing down one of the biggest corruption scandals in Western history. Each telling added new details, new feats of marksmanship that defied belief. But the core of the story remained true. A man who chose justice over vengeance, wisdom over glory, principle over profit. Parents told their children simplified versions as moral lessons. Young gunslingers spoke his name with a mixture of awe and aspiration. In Salvation, Sarah prepared for her own transition. After 20 years as sheriff, she found someone worthy of carrying on the legacy, a young deputy she'd trained in both law enforcement and ethics. "Remember," she told her successor, "the badge isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Every decision you make affects the whole community." Like when Eli Cade chose not to kill Clay and Whitmore, the deputy asked. "Exactly. He taught me that the hardest thing isn't taking a life. It's knowing when to spare one." The town continued to prosper, though few connected their good fortune with the regular, anonymous donations that arrived at the church. Food for the hungry, medicine for the sick, books for the school, all from an unnamed benefactor who asked only that the gifts be used to help those in need. Sarah knew, of course. She recognized Eli's hand in the careful planning, the precise timing of each delivery. He was still protecting the town, just in a different way. The years had been kind to Salvation. The scars of that long-ago confrontation had faded, replaced by new growth and new hope. The old mining tunnels had been properly sealed, the abandoned buildings repurposed or rebuilt. But the spirit of those events lived on in the town's dedication to justice, its refusal to look the other way when confronted with wrongdoing. And still, Eli watched from his hills. His hair had grayed at the temples, lines had deepened around his eyes, but his hands remained steady, his aim true. Each morning, he practiced his art, not out of necessity now, but out of respect for the discipline itself. On one such morning, as the sun painted the hills in shades of gold and purple, Eli made a decision. He packed his rifle, filled his canteen, and began walking. Not toward town, but deeper into the wilderness he'd come to love. A young ranch hand spotted him on the trail, and later swore he'd seen a legend, a lone figure silhouetted against the setting sun, rifle slung over his shoulder, walking with the easy grace of a man at peace with himself and his path. The story became part of the legend, another thread in the tapestry of tales about Eli Cade. Some said he was heading to new territories where his skills were needed. Others insisted he still watched over Salvation, appearing whenever justice required it. The truth, as always, was simpler and more profound. Eli had found what he'd spent his life searching for, not fame or glory or revenge, but the quiet certainty of knowing he'd used his gifts for the right reasons, in the right ways. As he walked into the sunset, Eli thought about Sarah's letter, about the town he'd helped transform, about the legacy he'd created not through violence but through its measured application. He thought about young gunslingers seeking glory and finding wisdom instead, about children learning to respect rather than worship the skills he'd mastered. The rifle on his shoulder was lighter now, its weight balanced by the knowledge that he'd used it to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than threaten. The legend of Eli Cade would live on, growing with each retelling. But the truth was in the lives he'd touched, the changes he'd inspired, the justice he'd served. And so he walked on, a guardian becoming part of the landscape he'd sworn to protect, his legend ensuring that others would follow his path, not of violence, but of principle, not of revenge, but of justice. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in fierce colors of red and gold. And somewhere in that majestic sunset, a lone figure moved steadily onward, carrying with him the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with bullets, but with the choice not to fire them. The legend of Eli Cade had begun with a bounty and ended with a blessing, a reminder that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it. And in that truth, his legacy would live on, as enduring as the western hills themselves. What would you have done in Sarah's position? When faced with the choice between duty and truth, between following orders and following your conscience? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption, justice, and sharpshooting excellence, make sure to like and subscribe for more gripping Western stories that explore the complex moral landscapes of the American frontier. And don't forget to ring that notification bell. After all, like Eli Cade himself, you never know when the next story might come riding over the horizon.